We're very happy to have today some of their speakers who've already spoken and some who haven't yet join this panel discussion on the future of biomedical imaging. And so we have Dr. Chris Winkner from Memorial Sloan Kettering who's here. We have Dr. Edinburgh from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. We have Julie DiMartino from New York Medical College, and we have Andy Myers from Lovelace and the Mind Research Network in Albuquerque, who joins us virtually. And so, as Dr. Amar mentioned this morning, one of the critical things for institutions is to decide where they should invest their meager resources and what areas are ripe for development and so forth. And so, since we have such an esteemed group here, I thought it would be valuable, we thought it would be valuable to get your opinions about some of these issues. And so I was thinking that we could talk about anything you want, but I was thinking that it might be interesting to talk about a couple of different areas. So first, maybe we could talk a little bit about issues related to translational imaging. You know, what do you see as the biggest opportunities going forward in translational imaging? Let's come back to that. The other areas that I thought we should consider is future directions in preclinical and clinical imaging. And related to that issue of future directions is, you know, what are the current technical challenges that you face in your work, and how do you imagine going forward and overcoming those challenges? And then finally, the question of core versus individual laboratory setups for imaging, and how you can weight and balance the relative merits and problems associated with that. So maybe we could talk about opportunities for translational imaging first. And I would ask, you know, again, the question of what do you see as the biggest opportunities in translational imaging going forward? And any one of you can take that question if you want to think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Testing?
Testing? Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much for those really thoughtful questions. I think there's a lot of big questions out there for us to consider. As I spoke earlier this morning, where I sit from the breast imaging AI perspective, we're really at the verge of this, just really this landslide of how the transformation of care. We're starting to see a trickle of different AI applications. For example, I was talking about within breast imaging, the same could be said in neuroradiology or in other areas, but really just with all of this data, I think if you think back like 10 or 15 years ago, we'd say, oh, there's so much data, we don't know what to do with it. Now we have stronger and stronger models and computational power at our disposal. We haven't even talked about large language models here today yet, or ChatGPT, which is really just transforming not just medicine, but the whole world, and just trying to keep an open mind about how things can really just look so different. The medical training takes a long time, right? You do college, and then there's medical school, and there's residency, and it's very subspecialized. And I think that that long process, combined with the fact that we want to make sure we're doing right by our patients in an evidence-based way, makes us a little bit of a more conservative field. So we're like a little bit behind, making sure, double checking everything before we go forward. But I think this whole wave is going to sweep us too. And it's going to transform not just how we're doing things today, but rethinking from the very beginning how we're training our clinicians, what kind of tool sets they need. I think that if you look at the requirements back when I applied to medical school, you had to do biology and chemistry and physics and math and maybe a writing course, and that was it. And now it's just hard for me to imagine being a top-notch medical center going forward without having more computational data science backgrounds, because so much of what we do is going to be paired with computers being able to synergize what we know and what they know. So I don't know if I'm directly answering the question so much, but I just think that there's going to be this whole new wave, not just of technologies to translate, but personnel and new types of jobs to try and monitor how we're using some of the tools that I discussed earlier.
Yeah, great answer. I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking along the lines of. I mean, clearly software is going to be an amazing component going forward, and computational skills will be critical.
Sorry, I'm interrupting the panel. Well, following up exactly on what you where you were saying, you talked about adoption by other clinicians. What are your patients saying in terms of the idea of having AI take over? I don't want to say take over, but really play a much more active role in possible diagnosis. And I ask from the perspective of someone who for a long time because we're kind of skeptical of how much AI will help us. And then, all of a sudden, like ChatGPT have changed the world overnight. And a lot of academics were still like, oh, we'd never trust that for facts. And now it's just kind of like a go-to for better or for worse. Like adoption is way more way more willing than we would have thought. What are the patients saying? Is this like a scary thing, a scary frontier, or is it like, oh, I want that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. I think your experience and trajectory probably mirrors larger society and patients being part of that because we're all patients too at one point or another. I Within the radiology community also, I can speak to the fact that if you go to the national meetings each year, starting maybe 8 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism about all of this stuff. And a lot of, and people being scared that it's going to replace you, take your jobs, right?
Pathology was exactly the same.
and now there's acceptance. I think we sort of moved from saying we're scared that they're going to replace us to people saying the radiologists who are using AI are going to replace the radiologists who are not using AI, and that being the new model.
But how long-lived would those radiologists be? They will soon be replaced by the AI using radiologists.
Right. No, you know what? I think that's true, and it's just sort of where the world's going, and you have to try and leverage what we can to best serve our patients. I think the patients also span the spectrum, and like the radiologists that I talk to, it's really a generational divide. Also, I think that the younger generation is much more accepting and willing to work with these new tools. We're in the process of clearing with legal using some of these deep learning algorithms, and that's been an interesting process as well. Some of the questions are what to do with the report that we generate, a radiology report. Do we explain to the patients that we're using this? And I think that the consensus in our institution is yes, but in getting to that point, I kind of informally polled a bunch of places around the country. It spans the gamut. So there's patients, there's some centers who are, and the other question is, the AI generates an output. Are we saving that as part of the medical record? Does that get distributed to patients or is it not? And that's controversial because there are definitely cases where the AI will say, this is suspicious. Then I'll look at it and say, no, I don't think it is. And do I really want to put that in the report? All the time, I work at a center where it's not just me reading medical images, it's my colleagues too, and I'll curbside them, right? I'll say, oh, I'm not sure about this. What do you think? And they'll give me their advice. And sometimes I listen to them and sometimes I don't. And if I say, oh, I'm not sure about this, and they say, yeah, I think that is something, and then I decide it's not, I'm not going to say Dr. So-and-so thought it was something. I think it's not. Don't worry. It just doesn't get part of the medical record. So I think there's lots of questions that go into, and I think we all experience this where still our conversations are not being recorded, but so much of what we do leaves a digital fingerprint, and what we do as a result of that, how that changes behavior is really part of the question as well. So I don't know. I think patients at the end of the day, though, just want what's best for them, and they'll rely, I think, on the doctor to make a decision. Well, what do you think, doc? What would you do? What would you do if it was your mother? People ask me that, and I think that's all we can do too. The problem is that there's no certainties. There's people make mistakes, computers make mistakes. We don't make the same kinds of mistakes right now, so maybe there's a way to synergize. But I think the future is that we're going to be using this stuff because it's just going to keep getting better and better, and it's going to outperform on the merits, and so we'll be adopting it.
I think it will be interesting. I know this was brought up in one of the talks, but to really try and understand how AI will change how we acquire imaging data in the clinic as well. We're already seeing a lot with compressed sensing and the rapid acquisition of imaging, but I sometimes wonder whether we'll start using the machines to start predicting, oh, we see this finding now, let's acquire this sequence now, instead of bringing a patient back or doing a contrast scan later, how we'll be able to change patient care in real time using this technology.
Yeah, that's something that we're actively trying to pursue. I think so. Light compressed sensing, that's a now a little bit of an older technique of a faster way to reconstruct medical images. GE and the other big vendors are also using deep learning algorithms to reconstruct images. There's always concern that there's going to be with generative AI, like hallucinations or things that pop up on images that aren't supposed to be, or vice versa, because you're sort of regularizing the reconstruction with the population of normals, whether there will be small findings that won't show up. But I think they're being cautious about it, and it seems to be going out well. One of the things we were talking about on the side earlier this morning is just that the medical imaging field has been developed to try and optimize the creation of images so that humans can make the diagnoses. And if computers are starting to do as well or better, or maybe even would be able to do even better if we designed the acquisition in a way that was optimized for the computer interpretation. And that's something that becomes a little more controversial when humans get left out of the loop because they don't even really have images to look at anymore. But then I like refer to pathology. You know, there's a lot within the pathology field that I don't think you guys are counting red blood cells anymore. Like a lot of the stuff is automated, and maybe radiology will just be like that, like another blood test at some point. So.
Excellent. What about hardware changes? I mean, we've talked, I mean, obviously AI and machine learning is going to make a huge difference, but going forward, but what about technical advances in hardware that are on the in sight going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I maybe not the best expert to speak to on that. I'm most familiar with the MRI developments, and I don't know of AI yet leading to huge accelerations in that. I'm sure they're using stuff for, I don't know, maybe someone else could speak to it more, but that seems to be sort of still linearly accelerating as opposed to like the exponential growth that we've seen once you have the data.
So I can't speak from the clinical imaging. I think so. No? Yeah, okay. I just have to be very close. Okay. So I can't speak to the clinical modalities, but I can speak towards the preclinical modalities. So when I started at Einstein, I was a member of the Biophotonics Center, and my main role as the physicist transitioning into biology was to develop new types of microscopes. And so the microscope that I showed you during my talk was a custom developed, and I think this is one of the questions that you probably get to, was a custom developed multiphoton microscope. Back in those days, there were a lot of innovations that we could add to multiphoton microscopy that eventually have been picked up by commercial manufacturers and incorporated into their commercial systems. From what I've been seeing is that the really useful technological advances, at least within multiphoton microscopy, confocal microscopy, have been established and adopted, and the efficiencies of scale that the microscope companies can bring towards the manufacture of a new microscope have really taken over what we can do inside of the laboratory. And so as I'm now transitioning to taking on the role of co-directorship within the Biophotonics Center, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's the next area of focus going to be? And we have really come to the conclusion that we want to switch away from new hardware development and switch towards computational analysis methods, processing the amazing data that these commercial systems can generate, and focus in more on applications rather than on microscope development. So utilizing things like functional imaging in the preclinical setting, things like optogenetics to control transcription and translation, using light in order to be able to set up in living organisms the types of experiments that you could only do in the past in Petri dishes.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about with regard to, say, two-photon microscopy and building new microscopes is the developments along the lines of holographic stimulation and holographic imaging using fancy new optic methods, you know, to be able to affect multi-point stimulation, multi-point imaging almost simultaneously in a 3D volume, which is like science fiction, but it seems to work. And so that's an area that I see as for hardware development to be really, really important. And will then, of course, require associated development in the software analysis, because again, there's just a huge amount of new data that's going to be generated, especially with high speed and very sensitive genetically encoded voltage indicators, for example, where now you have to sample it, 10 times the rate that you were sampling previously for calcium imaging indicators. So.
Administrator, would we have to consider storage? Obviously, this business is not a simple stick drive or anything like that you have on your computer. You're going to collapse the whole system. Do we need to get ready to significantly purchase either in the cloud or with vendors an amount of storage space to being able to juggle this around? And I need to hear, what are we talking about when I said significant amount of space?
So if I'm talking to you as an administrator and you don't have that already, you're behind. Yes. So yes, you definitely need it. Einstein for probably a decade now has had a petabyte data server in order to store all of this data. The real challenge there becomes access speeds, right? How quickly can you transfer a terabyte of data onto or off of the data server?
Well, no, let me step back. We do, and we have that aspect. I guess the question was very simple, just like what we did with physical data that we had, and we stored them by someone, and then when you needed information, you call that company and they bring to you the boxes. You can also do that.
Yes.
Would you be in favor of an approach like this, that they would store it separately and you would get access? You don't get huge charges. And what would you store on those places?
So from my perspective, I don't care where the data is stored as long as I have high-speed access to the data, right? So if it's from anywhere, exactly. However, I know colleagues, and I had a whole heated discussion at some committee meeting at Einstein. I have colleagues who deal with patient data, and having it stored somewhere nebulous in the cloud is absolutely unacceptable, right? Because of privacy concerns. And so, for me, my comment in the meeting was, I just need access to storage and then leave me alone, right? And then others were like, that's crazy. I can't work like that.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. I think there's a lot of regulatory burden when it comes to sharing clinical data that isn't there for preclinical data. And I think in terms of the cost, what we have found is that it really depends on what the data is being used for. If it's just cold storage, of course, there's no doubt, just go with Amazon because that's really cheap to do. But anytime you start accessing the data with inputs and outputs, that's when you tend to get the bigger charges from some of the bigger companies in terms of the data storage. I mean, it's a great way to share data across sites. And if we're talking from an inter-institutional collaborative standpoint, that would be the best way that we could do it. I think, again, there it just depends on the nature of the data from the regulatory perspective, whether it's human data that you got to worry about PHI versus preclinical data where there's a lot less regulations in place.
So I can talk to that my name is Rob Weber. I'm a periodontist and oral surgeon. So I'm on the surgical end of things. And it's a big problem for us actually, because I need data now. I have a patient in the chair, we take a 3D scan. I need that 3D scan now. The patient doesn't want to sit in the chair for 10, 15 minutes. And the dental school just went into the cloud, and it's a huge problem because our data now runs so slowly that we're trying to get surgery started. We have surgeries all the time in the dental school and the oral surgery sector. And our data is now slowed so much that it could now take us a half an hour before we can actually have all the data we need and do all the paperwork and do the surgery, because now our data is somewhere else and now we're having to download it. The other issue we have, which has become interesting, from your end of the point of view, you talked about AI evaluating this and doing this. So we have the opposite problem. We have all this great data, We're surgeons. We know what's behind the data. We know what the surgical techniques are. You have people that don't know that take these 3D scans and call up their local lab and create a guide and place implants. Well, what happens when something goes wrong with that implant? They have no clue as to how to fix it because the only reason they knew how to put it in was a robot basically told them to put the implant there, and they don't have any of the surgical skills required to actually fix a problem. So we have actually kind of the opposite issue of the dentist puts the implant in, something goes wrong, he has to find somebody to tackle that problem. And if most of us, if I didn't put the implant in, it's not so easy for me to just go, yeah, I'm gonna take on your problem that you developed. So it's a very interesting problem of this incredible ability we have to place implants, but then people that aren't trained placing the implants because a robot told them where to place the implant.
On similar note of the interrelationship between people and the big data, specifically in pathology, some of the cool work you were showing on, new possible biomarkers. I know that there are services now. I think Centaur Labs it's a company where for validating biomarkers in pathology. What do you do with your big data? Can you integrate like humans into it? And so there are companies that offer a service where essentially you outsource human scoring of data, and this supposedly is helpful for validating biomarkers. Have you heard of this kind of thing? Is this to me this seems like it seems like your results will only be as good as your scores really are, and training of the scores, maybe it just as hard take time away from training your model.
No, I this at all.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the specific example, but we talk a lot about garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you don't have good labels for whatever you're training, then your model's only gonna be that good. Although now there are more advanced types of unsupervised learning where there could just be some patterns in the image or in other applications that we're able to pull out with some of these large data sets. And so that's an interesting area too. I think it's always good to try and think about ways to develop models that are more scalable, that are going to be more robust, and that have some sort of not necessarily ground truth, but just some reliability to them that's beyond whatever our subjective current methods are. So
I would just say that, there's so much biological variability in samples, right?
Yeah.
To add in measurement variability it's just, shooting yourself in the foot. That's my opinion.
There's also the
I just
interesting. My apologies.
Sorry. No, go for it.
No, I just think you raise the ever-present, very interesting ethical question of what do you do when the machine selects a feature and you can't explain why that feature was selected, or what it really means in terms of how it was derived. That is something that happens with the newer algorithms, and I think that's going to be a real task for the future, is trying to reverse engineer what the machines tell us to develop the biological relevance, rather than the old way, which was, we determine what's biologically relevant and we train the machine to do it. So it is going to become, I think, a much more bidirectional relationship in the future.
Assuming you can interpret it, right? A lot of the deep learning methods, you'll never know why.
No, and I think that's exactly right. That's exactly the issue. How do we get past that?
right, I guess the question is whether we can. Biology is so complex that it's hard for us to keep everything in our heads. And the question is whether it'd be theoretically possible to build something that may be better at doing that than ourselves. It's hard for us to let go, and in terms of a ethical perspective, or just medical, legal, regulatory, I'm not sure how to deal with that sort of thing. But that definitely becomes an ethical quandary. What do you do when you have this system that, let's say for argument's sake, clearly outperforms outperforms what we're doing, and yet we have no idea how it's working, and we know it's not perfect, right? But it's definitely better than us. So there are going to be situations where it gets things wrong and we don't know, but more of the time than not, it gets things right. And then what do you do from an ethical perspective? In medicine, we go back to these core principles of bioethics, of beneficence, trying to do things in the best interest of the patient, do no harm, patient autonomy, and justice. And for the first two of beneficence and non-malfeasance, of doing no harm, maybe this would be better. There's also this patient autonomy piece, which has to do with patients being able to be involved in making their own decisions, and I guess the doctor's making some decisions too. But I don't know. I think we're about to see it's a very disruptive force in society, and we'll see how things go. It's interesting.
I just to add on to that, I think it's interesting nowadays that the choice of what tool and whether using AI and taking it out of the hands of people is acceptable is kind of akin to the sensitivity and specificity metrics when you're trying to validate a new biomarker, right? So you try to, depending upon what the clinical scenario is, you either want a test which is very, very sensitive and you're willing to sacrifice some specificity, or if the consequences of getting it wrong are really bad, right, then you sacrifice the sensitivity and go for the specificity, right? There's another factor which plays into this, which is the legal framework, right? And what are the consequences, not just in terms of human health, of getting things wrong? If there are legal consequences to getting things wrong, I think that puts a finger on the scale and influences whether use of complete machine algorithms is socially acceptable or not.
So I have a question that I think is probably relevant to everyone here. Dr. Winkler, I'm picking up on something that you said, whereas in terms of the future of AI in practice, and you were saying that it's not necessarily the question of whether or not AI will be used, but what we'll see is more people, there's a difference between the people who use it and the people who don't, at least in terms of clinicians. And that brings up for me kind of a broader question. So everyone here, although we've dwindled a little bit in the second session, we're kind of privileged in that we're coming from a perspective of, I think most people here use advanced analytics approaches. We all used cool imaging stuff, but we all work alongside with clinicians who don't necessarily buy into the AI thing, or people who do microscopy and do cell counting. And so there's kind of the haves and have-nots. How would you suggest that? How would you suggest we kind of modernize what everyone does? I mean, one of the, one of my hopes is that doing more events with this kind of template at various institutions is one approach. But I have no idea how would you batch modernize everyone's approach? Because I mean, there's labs that are not ours, right?
I mean, I could just give you my personal take on it. Education is definitely an aspect, right? So if you disseminate techniques and spread them around and you show people how to use it, then you're likely to get better adoption of a particular technique. But then you also have to keep in mind what is what are the people trying to do, right? Is this the only way to approach something? So I've had many collaborators come to me and say, we really want to do, intravital imaging. I think this can be answered. And then I look at the problem. I'm like, why? Why would you want to do this, right? This is way more complicated. Yes, it's a cool technique, but you could get the same answer using fixed tissue analysis. And so, I guess the solution is defining the use case scenarios very carefully so that people can say, here's the unknown information that I have, and that would be the tool. And we try, I teach a course at Einstein on imaging, and this is really the main goal of the imaging course, so that everybody has a breadth of knowledge of all of the different microscopy techniques that are out there, including MRI as well as ultrasound and electron microscopy, so that people can approach their biological problems and say, here's my tool bag. Which one of the tools am I going to pull that's most appropriate to answer the question that I have?
It's interesting. Oop, sorry, it's hard for me to see. I apologize for interrupting you. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, thanks. I think the question of adoption is really interesting, and the NIH recently had a workshop to try and redefine traumatic brain injury and how radiological common data elements were being used. And so, for the past 20 years, we've had this wonderful nomenclature and pathoanatomical system for quantifying different types of lesions in traumatic brain injury. And essentially, when, the committee met to look at how that was being adopted, even within the research community, we found that it was almost non-existent. Most people were not using it. And then, you have to work backwards and say, okay, well, if it's not really even being used in research, how is it being used in the clinic? And, most of the time for imaging findings, when we're conveying information across, generalists, it's a positive or negative imaging finding. And so we really struggled with, how do we not make it more complex, but actually how do we simplify the process so that there's going to be more general adoption amongst the people who are commonly use this, which are, community doctors who are under a lot of pressure to read scans or do their clinical duties and meet their sort of quota for reimbursement processes. So I think it's a really sort of complex question about how you transform a system, but then actually get it to be adopted for widespread use.
Yeah, no, I would just add from a clinical perspective, I think that the way we practice medicine is very much a top-down approach in the sense that there's certain guidelines for each clinical society of how to manage different things. And I think once AI tools infiltrate that and become part of sort of the practice plan or best practices for a given subspecialty, then they'll become more widely used. The other part is economics. Like, for instance, in breast imaging, AI became, or the older generation CAD took off when there were reimbursements. And that's a little bit of a cynical way to comment, but that's sort of how the system works, and that's how hospitals work and operate too. And so once these vendors get FDA approval and then lobby in Washington for CPT codes so that they can be billed, then that's how things will get used.
The first digital whole slide scanner to get FDA approval for use in the clinic, that was only 6-7 years ago, right?
Wow.
So regulatory hurdles are significant.
Yeah.
I think there's a...
So I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Julie, you had a question or you were going to make a comment before? No? Okay. Dr. Mufti?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Fascinating discussion about AI. Thank you. One thing we have to, I completely agree with your point regarding getting FDA clearance for a particular AI module. But I'll give you an example from the clinical world, from the clinical realm. We had an AI software that has been in use, FDA approved, in use for 25 years. So in the neuro world, AI has been around for a really long time. But it never actually took off. People did not see the value in it until there were 2 back-to-back randomized controlled trials that mandated, run by that same company, by the way, Rapid AI. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But they basically showed that you would basically rule patients into receiving treatment, and the outcome was better. So hence, they made it into the guidelines. So the guidelines now say patients are enrolled into this trial. They're eligible if, with the exact AI algorithm, with the exact AI software named in a guideline, which is quite honestly unheard of. But considering how strict and stringent guidelines are, but they made it into the guidelines. It was not FDA, they had the FDA clearance 25 years ago, but people didn't use it until you showed a benefit. So when you're talking about microscopy and using AI to help you one way or another, until you can demonstrate a clinical benefit of using AI, yes, it may be more complicated, but hey, If you identified one patient that you would have missed otherwise without the AI module, then yeah, maybe like the outcome's the same, but you just saved one more patient's life. So that's, I thought it was like a fascinating discussion, but I thought I'd chime in and just add this snippet of information.
One of the other topics that was on the list was relative value of core facilities versus individual facilities. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments about that while we're still chatting. And then we'll move on to the next talk. Yeah.
Maybe I can tell a little bit about it. So, well, everywhere I went before, we had very organized core. I trained in Bordeaux, France, where we are a Leica center. So the value, I think, of having a core and having a core that's like stamped by a specific brand of microscope, for example, like I know Nikon also does the Nikon centers, things like that, is that you get higher training. You get better training on microscope, and you also get exposure to many type of microscopy that you will not have the ability to get in terms of financially. I recently visited Nikon Center at Curie in Paris. You walk in and then you see a microscope every meters. It's insane how much they have. But they have like built custom build based on whatever you need. And that is because they are working with these companies and they are developing this. So like as a PhD student, I did high resolution microscopy, STED and STORM, and it was 2016. So it was very early on. We did like live STED imaging, which was not done before. And we were able to do that because we were like Leica Center, and they were like basically facilitating the acquisition of their material on our platform. And then I moved to do my postdoc at Sinai, where we also have a core that was not as well developed as now, but the organization as a core helped to get more funding and give more credibility for those companies to invest also in bringing their microscope in. I think that's what I see the benefits of having a very organized core, the training and the access to higher grade machines.
I think it also, thank you very much. I think it also depends very critically on the expertise of the core personnel, right? I mean, if one of the advantages of having advanced microscopy set up in one's lab is that you presumably have the expertise to actually execute.
So when you have a core, then what's happening is that, like, for example, Leica will train the core personnel on the machines, and you will basically get...
If you're a Leica
like, I mean, I'm talking about what I know. So that was like the Leica.
Not all cores.
The Leica aspect of it. So, but we had like, I know as a PhD student, I had access to multiple days training with hands-on trainings on machines. So this gives you like a knowledge of microscopy that, if I can go back to what David was saying, like sometimes people say, oh, I want to do 2-photon imaging. I mean, they basically want to have a cool image, but they don't understand, how hard it is to get it and how much you can extract out of it. And I think to merge those two, I think it's, the AI, it's going to be the same for basic scientists. It's going to be the one that do without and the one that do with, and the one that do with are going to do better. Because I think like when the technology start to spread, and at the scale it's spreading right now, in the past year, it was like crazy. I think it's, you don't adopt it, then you're already behind, because some people adopt it. And we also deal with large set of imaging, not maybe the same scale, but when we acquire, like Dr. Amas was asking, I did 6.5 years of 2-photon microscopy. I can show you the gigabytes. I have many hard drive with terabytes of data, because when you do a 1-hour movie, you already have tons of image. I think that I don't remember what point I wanted to make, but organizing a core basically, circling back, organizing a core basically is giving you like better training and better access to machines.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to say this delightful conversation has to be drawn to a close. I really want to thank our panelists. Yes, applause. Dr. Eckhreis-Winkler, Dr. Entenberg, Dr. Myers, thank you for joining us here, and Dr. DiMartino, thanks very much.